I think I had better first introduce myself. As you'll have guessed, I'm not from around here. I actually come from South Bend, Indiana. But before that, I was born and raised in the UK, ordained in the UK, and served in the Church of England there for many years till 1985. Which to me only seems like yesterday, but to some of you may seem ancient history. When I was invited to come and teach at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, because of my specialist interest in the history of Christian worship. I was there until I retired in 2013, but blessedly did not have to endure South Bend winters every year, because after 10 years of life there, the university asked me to become director of their London centre. So I was mostly able to live in London and be paid an American professor's pay, which seemed like it would be a good deal. And usually when I came to campus, I tried to avoid January and February. The so-called spring semester, which is not really spring semester, it's winter semester. And in 2013 I retired, and my son was already living in Dallas, having hated shoveling snow long before I gave up. So my wife, I was ready to retire to Oxford, and my wife said, no, we have to come to live with my son. So we compromised and came to live. Imagining that my son would remain here forever. But a year ago, he decided to move to Tampa, Florida. So, well, fortunately, I still have a daughter in Houston who's married, and 10 days ago gave birth to twins.
Oh, congratulations!
Which will be my first and last grandchildren, because so there we are. But having gone around all the Episcopal churches in the area when I first came here, I found it very hard to settle in one. This is a particular problem for someone who's an expert in Christian worship, because you can't help but sit at the back and go and I found that the churches whose worship I approved of generally had a theology that I didn't approve of, and the churches that had a theology I approved of were just sloppy and careless about liturgy. I'd been told by a priest friend of mine to try this church, but when I drove past it once, it looked too rich and snobby for me. But eventually, having tried all the rest, I came, and from the second Sunday onwards, it became not just the church I come to, but a spiritual home in a way. It's been a long time since there was any other place like that. So I'm happily retired. I now adopted the Episcopal habit of sitting as near to the back as I can. After all, I've watched others do it for years. And I occasionally like to perform at gigs like this, because it keeps. I love teaching. I just don't want to teach classes every day of the week. So I'm delighted to be with you tonight. That's me. Now let me say a word about the extract from Gregory Dix's The Shape of the Liturgy, which I've just been given, since a great part of my career has been nailing the coffin lid down on Gregory Dix. As a historical scholar, people still love him, and they love him for the passages like the ones you've got, which is fine, because he's very good at Eucharistic spirituality and piety and so on. But as a historian, he's been superseded. After all, that book was written in the year I was born. And so we scholars have done a lot of work since then, but it's very hard to convince other clergy who've been brought up on Dix to let go. But he writes such wonderful passages. Yes, he does. You read those, but nobody's a historian anymore. We've gone beyond that. That my rant is over. I want to talk for a little while about a few points about the Book of Common Prayer, and then I'm hoping that you will direct the conversation and so on in whatever direction you want to go, as long as it doesn't stray too far from my area of expertise. People sometimes wonder, why is it when you open the Book of Common Prayer, you don't get the Sunday service right at the front? And what stupid people buried it somewhere in the middle? Why doesn't it start with that? Well, go to the title page, if you will. Although we call it the Book of Common Prayer, its real title is the Book of Common Prayer and Administration of the Sacraments and Other Rites and Ceremonies of the Church, together with the Psalter of Psalms of David. The common prayer to which it refers is, in fact, the daily morning and evening prayer. And that's why it comes at the front. It's a book of common prayer to which all the other stuff in the book has been attached. So we treat the title as relating to the whole thing, but historically that's not the case. It was a volume for daily prayer, and the other services have been bound in with it to make a complete single volume prayer book. But the Book of Common Prayer, the Common Prayer relates to, is the daily morning and evening prayer. And that's been true since the first English prayer book of 1549. Archbishop Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury then, and it was of course in England and not here in the USA, that he was responsible for compiling it. And one of his great principles was that daily prayer shouldn't just be something that clergy and members of religious communities did. The daily office, as it's often referred to, should not just be something that was recited as an obligation by the clergy or by members of different religious orders, but it should involve the whole church. And he seems quite seriously to have expected that ordinary layfolk would join their parish priest in saying morning and evening prayer in their local church. And indeed, the first prayer book required the minister of that church to ring a bell before the service every day, morning and evening, to summon the people, or at least to make them aware it was going on. It didn't work, of course. People being people stick to their regular habits. To some extent it worked in a few places, but in the ordinary villages of England, you know, there were hordes of farmers and farm workers rolling up at church every day when they should have been out in the field and so on. So it never actually worked out, but that explains the structure of it. We can talk more about daily prayer and so on after I finish my opening remarks, but we'll start with that. The other great expectation that Thomas Cranmer had was that people would come to communion every Sunday. They came to church every Sunday because they'd always come to church every Sunday, but to come to communion every week was something that had not been true throughout the Middle Ages. People came to communion 1, 2, 3 times a year, that was about it. And they weren't going to change for Cranmer. And so, although he really did intend the Eucharist to be the central act of Sunday worship, he wouldn't allow it to take place unless there were a sufficient number of people who were willing to receive communion. So that meant that in most places there weren't a sufficient number of people to receive. Even in his first prayer book has a calculus for that in smaller parishes, if there are 100 people who are eligible to receive communion, there have to be at least 20 of them who are willing to do it, or you can't have the Eucharist. And so the diet for Anglicans and Episcopalians throughout the centuries on a Sunday was morning prayer, the litany, the first half of the communion service, but then you had to stop because there weren't a sufficient number of people to receive communion. So it's often called anti-communion, not anti with an I, anti with an E, before communion, not against. And it wasn't until the 20th century that the Eucharist began to become the central service on a Sunday morning, as it now is almost universally throughout the Episcopal Church, and not quite as universally in the Church of England or in other parts of the Anglican Communion, but it has become established as that. Through something called the liturgical movement, of which you may have heard, which was an attempt to restore Christian worship the way it should be, that spanned most of the 20th century, gaining ground mainly in the second half of the 20th century, involved in part looking back to what early Christians did, and in part trying to explore theologically what the various services were for, and so on. And that explains what has been really quite a revolution in terms of Anglican worship in the last 50, 70 years. And we would find earlier centuries of the Episcopal Church, and even more so the Anglican Church, to be quite different from what we now see as the norm. One more remark, and that is that the Book of Common Prayer is really the identifier of Episcopalians or Anglicans throughout the world. Who are we? We're the people who use this book. That's who we are, and it defines us. So it's our marker. But it's slightly more than that, because this is really our doctrine. We are one of those churches that requires you to use the order of service, so that when you go to any Anglican or Episcopal church anywhere, that's what you will get on a Sunday morning. No, nearly anywhere. You'll get what you'll get. You're always right. That's what you'll get on a Sunday morning. That identifies who we are. You know then, when you walk in the church, what tradition it belongs to. So we're required to use it. That makes us different from other churches, including, say, the Methodist Church, which has a worship book, but the ministers don't have to use it. That meant that as an option, to be helpful, but not a requirement. So you wouldn't be able to identify service as Methodist, depending on the book. So we belong to churches in that family, like the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church and so on, who have a book. But unlike them, our only core doctrine is the book. You know, if you're a Lutheran, you know that it's not the Lutheran Book of Worship or whatever you use at the moment. It's a whole host of other documents that define what Lutheranism is. Same with the Roman Catholic Church. It's not the order of Mass that defines who they are. It's a whole host of doctrinal pronouncements through the ages that define what Roman Catholicism is and what Roman Catholics should believe, even if they don't. But with us, although the Church does put out other statements, General Convention meets and passes resolutions and so on, our core doctrine is in this book. So that we say to people, if you find your faith in here, if you find that the way we worship reflects what you believe, then you can be one of us. There are no other doctrinal tests. It's just the willingness to use this book and accept it as embodying your faith. That doesn't mean that what's in the book is narrow in its doctrine. A great deal of the book is open to wide interpretation, deliberately so. But nothing appears in the book that people would find objectionable. And I'm not just talking about this book, I'm talking about the Book of Common Prayer as it generically is throughout the whole of the Anglican Communion. Obviously there have been lots of different provisions, and the book, current book in England or in Canada, is quite different from the prayer book here. But every church, every one of those provinces, as they're called with the Anglican Communion, revises and shapes the book. But it never has in something to which the whole congregation can't agree. The whole congregation of the church, I don't mean both, can't agree. It doesn't have minority services for minority folks. It doesn't force certain beliefs upon people that they can interpret material one way or another, and it excludes anything that some might believe but others might not. And so in that way it provides this overall concept, I would say, rather than doctrine, of the church and its beliefs in its worship. So it provides a much more significant role than simply being the order that we use in church on Sunday. Is that enough to get you going? Got some ideas, thoughts, objections?
Question.
Yes.
I'm very new in coming and visiting the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly when you say that this is about the doctrine of Episcopals.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want to learn all about what the Episcopals are, this is the one?
The core is
That's what I mean.
I mean, we may believe other things as well. So, you may be aware there's an old joke, which is there's a book called What Episcopalians Believe. But yes, anything else that the church has said and so on is really peripheral to all that. What our core of our faith is the way we worship. It's the orders of service in the book. It's what we say and do in our worship expresses our core beliefs. We do it, because we do it one particular way and not another. That is. Yeah.
I remember when I was a child, we did the morning service, and I loved that service.
Mm-hmm.
I was really sad when it went away.
Yeah.
Did they do it anywhere?
Cathedrals.
Oh.
Not necessarily cathedrals in this country, but certainly in England, the cathedrals of England all do some morning prayer and evening prayer, as well as the Sunday, and they also do some evening prayer all through the week. Do said morning prayer, but have a choir, some evening prayer, even if it's all that. And I actually find, some evensong during the week a wonderful way of praying. It's just that you can't easily get it here and now. Quite lots of clergy retire to English cathedral cities because then they can go every day and just share in the worship. And you've got a professional choir and so on who are actually doing it.
Incarnation and St. Matthew's.
Do they?
I'm not saying they do evening prayer, but evening.
Yeah.
Incarnation does even song.
Yeah. On Sundays. Yeah. But
It's a week. So if I go to any Episcopal church in the area,
yes.
everybody has the same.
Yes. Everybody's the same book. They may make different selections from it because there's some options in it. There were the original 1549 prayer book had virtually no options at all, because but as history has gone on, more options have come in, so there is more choice, but it should be based on this.
So within the Episcopal, there are no divisions or subdivisions. Or
We all agree.
it's
on
just
that.
one. No, because there are the Orthodox, that they are Greek, and the other ones they are not Greek. So I don't know. Of course, it's a different denomination, but they are all together in one.
Oh no, we argue like mad. Great disagreement, but it's our desire to stay in communion that makes us do some of the most illogical things to hold us together and come up with all sorts of ways of doing that, which don't really make sense, but they do enable us to stay together. And there's a sense of Episcopalians and Anglicans worldwide that they simply want to be in communion with one another. They don't want schism. It does happen, but they don't want it. Do we need to talk about the Anglican Church of North America? Or?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I was just somewhere, and I said that I had been a lifelong converted, converting her to become Episcopalian. And she said, well, I said, you're Episcopalian. She said, no, we're Anglican.
Yeah.
So I assume that
Yeah.
it has to do with some sort of not agreeing with something.
Yes.
But I came in and I said to my husband, why do we say, what's the difference?
Absolutely. It's only in this country will the term Anglican mean non-Episcopalian. Do you see what I mean? Or actually, from their point of view, they're the proper Episcopalians, the Anglicans. We've gone on. I'll explain why in a minute, but it's just a thing in this country. You wouldn't find it anywhere else. Other places that are called Anglican really are Anglican. You can see, I mean, you can see why when Scotland went Presbyterian, the people who wanted to remain loyal to the Anglican Church couldn't call themselves Anglican. To call yourself Anglican in Scotland, it's as bad as calling Scots people English. I mean, you know, there's nothing worse you can say to a Scotsman. So it became the Episcopal Church in Scotland. And so when we, here in this country, came along, not only did we get our first bishops from Scotland and a pressure to use Scottish forms of the book of prayer, we also naturally called ourselves Episcopalian, because calling yourselves Anglican after the Glorious Revolution would not have gone down well here either. So there are one or two other Episcopal churches in the world. Episcopal, yeah, it means basically church ruled by bishops. Episcopus is Latin and Greek for bishop. And so it's a church which has maintained bishops, unlike say the Lutheran Church, which thought whether you have bishops or not was irrelevant, or the Methodist Church, which does have bishops, but not in the so-called. I've just realised what I'm getting into now. We're now in this deep water of. Okay, well, apostolic succession. We need to start with that. It is the belief of the Roman Catholic Church that there is a direct line of descent from St. Peter as the first bishop of Rome down to all the current bishops, or all linked together in line, and that forms apostolic succession. Initially, it's questionable for two reasons. Initially, it's very hard to trace this line for the first few generations. It doesn't look as though the Church of Rome did have bishops in succession to one another for a century. I mean, so there, you know, they'll give you a list of names, but it's dubious list. So, and secondly, in that period, what they meant was succession in office. So here is the Bishop of Rome, an ancient and venerable see. So his successor, who sits in the same chair, inherits his authority and his reliability as I should have written this, as a guardian. Later it comes to mean the bishop who has the power to pass on to you through the laying on of hands in ordination the episcopal office and its powers and so on. As a very revered professor of liturgy once said, in the early church it was more a matter of bottoms on seats than hands on heads. But this sort of pipeline theory of transmission, you see what you've got me into? This pipeline theory of transmission held throughout the Catholic Church. And when the Church of England split from the Catholic Church, Roman Catholics claimed that we'd broken the line of succession. So our bishops weren't real bishops and our priests aren't real priests, because the line got broken. They had all sorts of stories and explanations as to why the lie got broken. We didn't believe the right things when we put hands on people's heads. This is the part of my original doctoral dissertation we've now wandered into. We're not going to pursue that one too much detail. It explains, first of all, that separation. Yes, so I've covered it. So bishops are, and there are many Episcopalians who still believe the pipeline theory of transmission. I'm, as you can see, dubious because I don't think it matters. Those who do. But the important thing of the Church of England, and this brings us back to the book, we have bishops, and therefore, you know, we need to accept governance by bishops, whether or not we believe in absolute succession, grace being transferred from hands to heads. Back to the issue. The remarkably few breakaways from the Anglican tradition in its history, remarkably few, very tiny ones. But the bigger ones came in the 20th century, initially occasioned by threats of a number of things, but the actual thing was the ordination of women, which triggered it off, because that was regarded as un-Catholic. You know, the Church of England had never ordained women before, and now it's doing something that the Church as Paul had never done before. When they talked about the Church, they were forgetting the churches of the Reformation. They were focusing on Orthodox and Catholic, never done before. And it was further troubled by things like the acceptance of gay Christians and so on. So they broke away, claiming, of course, to continue the succession and so on. I'll tell you, this is one of the illustrations of how we bend over backwards to stay in communion. When I'm in England, and I'm a clergyman of the Church of England, I'm in communion with the Lutherans of Scandinavia. Not the rest of Europe, but Scandinavia. Why? Because they accidentally kept bishops. So they do have real bishops here, as far as we're concerned. Even if Roman Catholics don't think we do. But when I'm here, I'm in communion with the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, because we've softened our firm stance on apostolic succession and all that, and we're prepared to treat Lutheran bishops as real bishops, even though they're not. Is that really what we are? So well, but that would be far too liberal to for England. When I was a boy, there was something called the Church of South India, which was formed as a reunion of Protestants and Anglicans in South India. It decided that they would just regard all the ministers of all the previous churches as valid ministers, which is something Anglicans never did, which have to have episcopal hands and the rights of episcopal hands. So in England now, if a bishop has laid hands on women, some people regard him as tainted. He can't possibly lay hands on them. And so we've got something called forward in faith, which is really backward in bigotry. But in those days, no Anglican would accept a Protestant minister as like an Anglican priest. So there were extreme churches in England that put up in the porch of the church. This parish is not in communion with the Church of South India, just in case a wandering South Indian happened to arrive. It made them feel better. So does that help at all by wandering around? So they are conservatives who either A, have maintained the true Anglican church faith, or B, fail to move the times. Take it.
In the Episcopalian Church, how are bishops chosen?
By election, which is a very modern. I mean, technically, in the ancient church, bishops were chosen by election, and some pretty dark politics were involved by about the 4th century with that, and it increasingly became technically an election, but you didn't have any choice. And so, in England to this day, the sovereign, who is the second, appoints bishops. In the past, the Prime Minister could advise the Queen of who should be appointed, and the King, whoever it was, and that's how they got appointed. Now, we're slightly more democratic. We have a commission which comes up with two names of possible bishop, which it passes to the Prime Minister, who traditionally was supposed to choose the first name. But we had to give him two, so it looks as though he was choosing, and pass on to. You'll think I'm getting crazy. Oh, you did already. To pass on to the sovereign until Gordon Brown, I think it was, when he was Prime Minister, decided it was nonsense, and so it goes straight to the sovereign, which doesn't interfere. But in the past, Prime Ministers could interfere. Said, for instance, that Mrs. Thatcher didn't always choose the first name on the list if she didn't like the person. But here, and the Church of England claimed it had abolished elections because they were unwholesome and tainted and all that. You know, democracy was a bad thing. But here, in this democracy of democracies, that we've gone back to elections.
And the voting members are?
The election of a bishop can only take place in a convention of the diocese. So, for example, the Diocese of Dallas, if our bishop were to retire or for any reason leave, then the convention would meet, would be a full convention to elect, and the representatives of the parishes would all go to the diocesan offices, and they would vote then for a new bishop. And that's how we get there.
And would that bishop be, would they have a choice of candidates? Would they be interviewed?
Yes, there's usually, I think almost always, there's a sort of committee that works on this for several months, getting names together, and they may have as many as 20 or 30 names that they whittle down to about 4, and those are presented to the convention. You actually meet them. They come out, and usually there are about 3 or 4 places in the diocese where the bishops will be, and you can go and hear them speak on different subjects and decide whether they're Gittings, Neiman Marcus material or not, and if they are, then you know who to vote for.
The reason I offered it to Father Roper is that although I'm a priest of the Diocese of Northern Indiana, I'm not a priest of this diocese, I'm a priest of the Diocese of Indiana. We only ever had 2 bishops in the time I was there. One when it was too early for me to get involved in the proceedings, and the other went just after I retired, when again it was too late for me to get involved in the proceedings. I've never done any of that. I did once vote for union with the Methodists. They got all the clergy of the Church of England about a few days after I'd been ordained to vote whether they wanted to go into union with the Methodists. And we had, in every diocese, we had a big Eucharist of the Holy Spirit, so that the Holy Spirit would direct us in the right way, and the Holy Spirit voted by a majority, but not by 2/3, that we should join them. So we're still not trying to do this. You see how wide we're wandering?
Well, I've attended Episcopalian churches for years. My mother married a Catholic and lived with her. So my phone book of prayer has notes from her. And it's about the morning prayer. She says, start here. I know we're in lectionary C, so I have to follow along.
Yeah.
But she says, start here. And I don't understand her notes. And then there's a morning prayer right too.
Yeah.
How do I know?
Oh, well, just like the Eucharist has 2 forms, you never remember which is first and which is second, but right 1 and right 2. Yes, I know. So, is that the traditional language one and the one? So, right 1, Eucharist on Sunday, which we did once a couple of years ago during Lent. And I talked to him. Is the traditional language model that is therefore closer to the private tradition, and right 2 is really just the main change between are mainly of language, not much else, but mainly of language. That is in the sense it doesn't have these and that's and so on. It's supposedly contemporary language. And the same is true of forms of morning prayer. There's a traditional language form and there's a more modern language form. And it's the same basic form every day. What changes are the readings, as you were mentioning. I mean, in fact, we talk about people not joining in. It's been the desire, I think, of very many clergy that lay people would share more by praying on their own. If they, I mean, for most people coming together, I mean, when it was a village, it was a bit more realistic for Cranmer to think that people could come. But you know, you can't get in farmers to church at all. It's really difficult. I had a rural parish in England. Well, it'd been a rural parish, and it did a place where they did the blessing of the plough, which comes on the Sunday after Epiphany, because that's ploughing season. And they kept a plough in church, and we used to bless it every year and recite the names of all the farms that had once existed, because most of them have now been taken over by housing and so on, of commuters to London. And it was a big turnout of the commuters to London who were living in the. But I looked and thought, I can't get farmers to come. And I looked back through his history and found we never got farmers to come. You know, it was a thing the townies liked in the country for those great traditions. But the farmers, nah. So, you know, it's not surprising that he couldn't get many people to do it. But it's been, again, part of the liturgical movement. It's been the desire not just to make the Eucharist and communion a weekly act, but also to encourage daily prayer. And there are a number of different, I mean, what most people think about with their own eyes, gosh, all this, you know, well, there are some alternatives, you don't have to do every bit of it. But it is quite a lot of meat when you start on it. So maybe something more like milk would be easier. And so I gather Compline is a regular thing here. That's a fairly modern addition to the prayer book, reproducing an ancient tradition of monastic communities. But it's become popular partly because it's a late night service and it has more of that sort of feel about it than. When I was first ordained, we sometimes used to say evening prayer at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so we didn't have to come back after our. So it's often hard. Well, first of all, morning prayer. You know, am I awake and do I have time? And evening prayer. But Compline has caught on and become enormously popular in many places because it's short, because it fits the time of day. So we're not trying to put people onto a guilt trip that you should be doing morning and evening prayer every day, though if you did, it would be wonderful. Even I'm against all those readings every day. When I was involved in revising the one in England, I got a provision made that you could do the readings at some other time and just do the other bits. Whether anybody follows me or not, it suited me. I was in a position to exercise some influence over the Church of England. There are a few bits of what the Church of England does which are my fault, but the rest of it. But it's establishing a daily routine of prayer, which is something that the rest of the Church are doing, so it unites you with folks. And is a discipline of doing it as a matter of regularity, like going to the gym, which I used to be. Does that help at all?
Yes, it does tremendously, thank you.
Yes.
The question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead now.
The expansive language that we're using here, transfiguration, is the possible end result of that going to be right number 3? Well,
a prayer book revision is a very expensive and time-consuming process. Taking many years to do properly. And I don't think there was any appetite in General Convention for another complete round. Although, you know, it's a 1979 book, so it's been going a long time. Whereas the Church of England had a 1980 book and now has a 2000 book, so 20 years seems to be about the lifespan as things move on and on. But this was a way of Well, I mean, it's not the first thing. Supplemental materials were produced before this and so on. A way of, rather than facing complete revision head on, to provide optional resources that could be substituted or added to the existing ones. I don't know, beyond our self-hits, I don't go to many other places of worship nowadays like I used to. I don't know how widely that's being taken up. I suspect it varies, depending on the enthusiasm of the rector, whether he or she may be. But I think that's as far as we're going for now. I think part of it is taking the temperature, seeing whether the church is ready to move on, and in what ways it thinks we should move on, and in what ways it's quite happy to keep what we've got. I mean, I happen to think the 79 book is far superior to the original 1980 book of the Church of England, and so in many ways our 2000 book was catching up with some of that stuff. Yes, sorry, you are.
That's okay, he was first.
Yeah. By a slide.
I don't know if that question is going to be related. Is the Bible from the Episcopal anything different from other Bibles?
There are basically two forms of Bible, what are often called the Catholic and the Protestant forms, and that stems from the 16th century Reformation. Up till then, the Catholic Church had been using what had been the Bible of the early church in Greek, but translated into Latin. So it had all the books that were no differences in the New Testament. This is only simply about what's in the Old Testament. As far as the New Testament is concerned, they're identical. Apart from often put in footnote to explain that Jesus' brother wasn't really Jesus' brother in the Catholic. But New Testament is on the whole identical on Catholics, Protestants, everyone. It's the question of the length of the Old Testament. And the difference there is that there's a difference in order of books and in the number of books. Because the early church accepted some more recent Old Testament books as part of what's called the canon of Scripture, the collection. And that continued up to the Reformation. The Reformers decided that those late books in the Old Testament of the Catholic Church, which had been written in Greek and not Hebrew, would be excluded, and the only books would be the original Hebrew books, not these later Greek books. So the Catholic Old Testament is longer, more books, different order, and Protestants don't regard those other books as canonical. We occasionally read bits from them, but we don't regard them as canonical in the same sense. You see that? They're called either apocryphal scriptures or deuterocanonical scriptures or some description like that to indicate an inferior status. Is that a bit too much technical? Just showing I do know something, that's what I do. Sorry.
This may have already been asked, if so, don't answer it.
I can always answer it.
I hear that the Episcopal Church is kind of in trouble with the Anglican Communion, or like
yes.
on probation or something.
Oh yes.
Where is
We
that
are
headed?
far too liberal, far too liberal. It's all over sex. It's always all over sex. We have just gone ahead with things the Church of England is reluctant to do, and so we've put ourselves on the outside. And it's about the recognition of same-sex marriage, which is funny, really, because England legally accepts same-sex marriage. It's just that you can't do it in church. Whereas the Episcopal Church has gone further in its attitude, not only to same-sex marriage among lay people, but also among clergy. And so the official Church of England position, which is influenced by and shared by a large number of African churches which are even more conservative, tends to regard the Episcopal Church of the USA, which, by the way, calls itself now TEC, the Episcopal Church. It doesn't really go down well in Scotland, which also is an Episcopal church. It was better when it was called Ecusa, which is what it used to be referred to. See, I get sidetracked really easily. So it's trying to keep the Anglican Communion together problem again. You know, it's not just trying to keep the Church of England together or the Episcopal Church together, it's trying to keep the whole of the Anglican Communion together. And most places are much more conservative, and particularly in Africa. And for some Africans in particular, the problem is that they live in sometimes Muslim majority countries, but certainly countries with large numbers of Muslims, and have to, in effect, compete with Muslims. And for them to weaken on the traditional sexual teaching of the Anglican tradition would be seized on by the Muslims as a sign that the church is weak and corrupt and unfaithful. And so they're in a very difficult position. Even if they wanted to be liberal, the political situation makes it very hard for them. Some of them, of course, don't want to be liberal at all, so it suits them very nicely.
And some of the laws of
the countries, it's all. That's right. So they're in a very difficult position, and because the Archbishop of Canterbury is, I suppose you'd call titular head of the Anglican Communion, in the sense that he calls together something called the Lambeth Conference every 10 years of bishops throughout the world. We must be coming up to another one.
Next year.
Next year. He's trying to not rock the boat. So they're trying to hold the ground in the middle, and have had therefore to take this action because the Lambeth bishops of the last conference really pushed in that direction of putting the Episcopal Church, you know, on the edge. Because in its view, it's gone too far. It should wait for the rest of us. Of course, the irony is that the Church of England itself is very largely more liberal in its treatment. I mean, you know, how could it be otherwise? When I first went to teach at the second seminary I taught at, no, the first seminary I taught at, I went to teach there, and I said to my fellow clergyman who had been my best man at my wedding, so and been at seminary with me, and I said, this is very different from the seminary you and I went to. There are an awful lot of gays here. He said, which seminary were you at then? No, really? But we had a principal of the seminary who said there is no homosexual problem here. So there was no homosexual. And that's a bit like the Church of England is, you know, at the top, they're insisting, you know, for instance, the bishops gave in on civil partnerships, which was the first step in this direction, by saying, well, it doesn't necessarily mean they're sleeping together. So the bishops squared their consciences with that. And also, there's a very strong evangelical wing in the Church of England that you don't get in the Episcopal Church. If you want to be a real Protestant, you're not an Episcopalian in this country. But in England, you probably are. The Anglican Church has a large and wealthy segment of it that's very evangelical, and they also have to be reconciled with all this. So it's a terrible balancing act. And even now, when it's become the law of the language, you know how we used to do this is absolutely ridiculous, but this is what we used to do. We weren't allowed, when I was first ordained, to marry in church anyone whose partner was still alive. You know, if they've been divorced, want to get married again, we weren't allowed to do it. And, you know, I've had tearful scenes where he's saying, I know I've been married before, but this is her first, and you shouldn't. You know, so they came up with a typical Anglican compromise. You can't conduct the ceremony of marriage in church, but you can offer a service of blessing. Wait a minute. So the secular bit we can't do, but the religious bit we can do. See? Well, it was the compromise we lived with for years. And even now, the rules have got easier, but we see we are behind you. So this causes tensions throughout the Anglican community. Because we don't have a curia, a central doctrinal authority that tells us this is what you must believe, or at least appear to believe, and if you have views you can't hold up here, you have to keep your mouth shut on the model. Sorry, that's unfair to the Roman Catholic Church. We have difficulty in agreeing on things, and it's unlikely we'd ever agree on everything. But this desire to stay together makes us do strange things just because we want to, as far as possible, remain one church with broadly common, although, as I said, the prayer books are different throughout the community, you'd recognise them as a family. If you put them all together, you'd recognise that they're all related. And it centres around a number of things. That's why, you know, you have to accept bishops, even if you just think they're administrative figures dealing with the church and no theological value at all. That's all right, as long as you accept bishops. So what you believe about them doesn't matter. And if at the top level they're doing things like, you know, well, are your hands pure? You know, who laid hands on you? Are you teaching Roman Catholic students as I did? I would tell them this stuff about in 1896 the Pope declared Anglican orders absolutely null and utterly void, and that is technically how we are. But the Anglican Church, which of course didn't think that, but nevertheless thought it prudent to invite what are called old Catholics to share in the consecration of new bishops. Because the old Catholics were Catholics who broke away from the Catholic Church in 1870. So they clearly still are real bishops and real priests. They may have broken away, but they didn't lose the connection. So if we now plug in the old Catholics, so, you know, Archbishop Michael Ramsey, who ordained his own consecration as a bishop, included an old Catholic, so I got it back through that chain. And believe me, if the day ever comes, and I pray for it constantly, that Anglicans and Roman Catholics come back into communion with one another, that's how they'll do it. They'll say, well, yes, we were right in 1896, but we're also right now because the situation has changed. And if there was enough, many theologians and Catholic theologians, if there was enough will to do it, it could be done. We don't have a doctrinal problem, we just have a will.
I know the Anglican Church of North America, they're not part of the Anglican.
Yeah.
But that you know of, they use
no, I think they have their own book now, I think.
The Anglican Church?
Yeah.
They use it.
Oh, do they? They're not church. Which just shows you how you can interpret things. I mean, you know.
I met a lady and asked her, and she said, yes, they use it.
Yeah.
But they're not in communion with Catholics.
No, except there's always that.
Always an except.
Because Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has a sort of fondness for them, because I think that he's really underneath very conservative and very evangelical, completely different from his predecessor, and he's always trying to sort of get them on the fringe somehow, you know. And I think he looks for reconciliation, so he's prepared to be, but I mean, technically no, but you know. Because it's a significant number again, and so that I think means that overtures will be made. As in a very strange tradition in the Diocese of Northern Indiana, where one of the priests of the diocese, English, had been ordained, long before the Anglican Church in North America, being turned down for ordination by the Church of England, and got himself ordained by some bishop or other. Another weakness of Western theology generally is that you can be a bishop even because of this pipeline theory. You know, once a bishop, always a bishop, and all it needs is a bishop to ordain you, and you are ordained. You don't actually have to be in a church, a part of and so on. So there always have been through history people called Episcopi vagantes, wandering bishops, who were legitimately ordained by the rules of the time, but really had no connection at all. You know, we have a wrong theology for it. And he'd been ordained by one of these groups, and tended to pass from group to group, and eventually became a bishop through these, again, technically, and then decided he'd like to return to the fold, and the fold he chose was the Diocese of Northern Indiana. And the bishop said, I will recognize you as a priest, but not as a bishop. And so he was in the diocese as a priest, but I have tons of Facebook photos of him in Episcopal garb and the whole works. He's a nice man too, and actually writes a lot of sense, but we're a funny lot. Yes.
Last night I heard that when Henry VIII, this was on Think on KERA, when Henry VIII took over, you know, the church in England, that he did away with convents.
Yes.
And why was that?
Two reasons. One, that religious life by the Middle Ages had become rather corrupt. I mean, you know, in terms of its strict observance of its own rules and piety and so on. But more importantly, it had become very rich. You're short of cash when you're a king. You look for likely sources. You dissolve the monasteries, you get all their cash and treasures and everything, which you can then hand out to various favourites, bits of them to various favourites, and so on. In the days before regular taxation, so it was as much a need to lay hands on the treasures of the monasteries as it was to shut them down because of dissolute life. And I think both were true. There's Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's enforcer, went round the country shutting these places down, dissolving them. And he found one little abbey in the Midlands. I can't forget his name. And he wrote down, "This one's for me." And it's now a conference house of the diocese. And I stayed there, it's lovely. I can see why I did that. You know, and so religious life in the Church of England and then in the Episcopal Church did not resurge until the 19th century. Lots of things that we take as normative for Episcopal Church or Anglican Church were really developments from the 19th century onwards, then reinforced by the liturgical movement of the 20th century.
Was that the result of the Oxford movement?
Yes.
Or was there...
See, when you have people in the audience who know this stuff, yes, the Oxford movement was afraid that the Church of England looked as though it were willing to make itself an arm of the state. It wanted to claim a spiritual existence independent of. It didn't want disestablishment, but it just wanted to claim the spiritual nature of the Church. And particularly the second phase of the Oxford movement wanted to reclaim Catholic practices, which meant everything that contemporary Roman Catholics were doing. I mean, this is uncritical. There were true people in the Church of England who wanted to reclaim the medieval English traditions, but there were also those, so there are degrees of Catholics, if you like. So the late 19th century brought about restoration of religious life, both for women and for men. Sadly, most of the communities have gone, particularly the male communities. The Cowley Fathers, who are of a place in Boston, is it strictly called the Society of St. John the Evangelist, had their home place in Oxford as an offshoot of the Oxford movement, but sent missionaries all over the world. And they founded, they had a house in London. Eventually they gave up the Oxford house in London. The fellow priest of mine went and came out and said to his friend, "You and I should join. In 10 years it'll all be ours." The age of... so sadly, it's mostly in decline. And the Cowley Fathers here in Boston are probably one of them more alive. Franciscans are still alive in good ways. The female communities have gradually dwindled, largely now too. I mean, the problem comes that they're basically old people who need looking after, and there aren't enough younger people entering. Sad, brief resurgence of religious life now. Which, I mean, it's happened to some extent on Catholic religious orders, but because they're much bigger in number and so on, and although there are declines going on there, it hasn't been as decimating as it has for Anglican religious orders. How are we doing? Always by the time we stopped. Another good moment of I've enjoyed myself enormously. Please don't thank me for doing it. I get the pleasure.
We're still glad you came.
Thank you.
Yes.
Shall we have a few moments quiet and then we'll move on into